They retaliated with tariffs, right? And they've been at 17 years of trade wars, which has an enormous impact.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. The last time you took a commercial airline flight, odds are that you were on a plane that was manufactured by one of two companies, American-based Boeing or French-based Airbus. Together, these two companies have almost the entire market for commercial airplanes. A piece published recently at the website American Compass makes the argument that Airbus is a success story for industrial policy. European governments identified a need, decided that they should compete with foreign manufacturing of airplanes. They made the public money-backed investments and propelled Airbus past Boeing and others to be the world leader. As American Compass said when publishing the piece, quote, "According to free market dogma, state-backed Airbus shouldn't have been able to compete with Boeing. Instead, Airbus surpassed Boeing as leading aircraft manufacturer, gaining a reputation for cutting-edge innovation. U.S. policymakers should take note." The American Compass piece really took off. But is it really describing reality for Airbus and Boeing? Mercatus Center research fellow Veronique de Rugy says that those claims need some serious grounding. In response to the American Compass piece published at National Review, de Rugy flies into the industrial policy headwinds and argues that while crony capitalism certainly works for the companies it benefits, that doesn't mean that it's good for the entire country. Buckle your safety belts and secure your deployed oxygen masks, because today I talk with Veronique de Rugy about the turbulent claim that European industrial policy to boost Airbus worked, the reality of massive American public subsidies to Boeing, and whether advocates of industrial policy can actually bring their stated goals in for a safe landing. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Veronique de Rugy, welcome to Acton Line.
Thank you for having me.
So the piece that you published at National Review, A Closer Look at Aircraft Industrial Policy, is taking a look at another piece that was published at American Compass, the title of which is Airbus's Industrial Flight Plan. For our audience, before we get into your piece and your reaction to this American Compass piece, could you give us an overview of the argument that's being made in the American Compass piece about Airbus, about its and European industrial policy, and what the author thinks the implications of the Airbus story are for the United States, for how the United States should potentially approach industrial policy vis-a-vis Boeing, the biggest aircraft manufacturer in the United States? What is the argument that's being made in this American Compass piece?
So I'm going to try to be fair to and just represent their views as fairly as I can. I think the argument that they're making is to say, look, in the 70s, a consortium of governments, of European governments, wanted to create an aircraft manufacturing company to compete with what they saw as the U.S. supremacy at the time, and it included not just Boeing, even though Boeing was still the dominant force of that supremacy, and so they decided to invest a lot of money, give subsidies, give loan, very preferential terms for Airbus, and it paid off. That's the message. It's like today, Boeing obviously is still there, but between the two of them, between Airbus and Boeing, they have 99% of the market in commercial aircraft, and Airbus is now getting more shares of that market, and hence it shows that industrial policy works. And not just this. One of the things that they like about Boeing is that their supply chain is intentionally European, that and so hence employs a lot of people and things like this. So it's like look, it works. It kind of has a vast network of companies throughout Europe employing people. We like employment, especially employment in manufacturing. Having jobs is good for the family. I think that's kind of the implications, because it's part of a series about how industrial policy can improve communities, and it can improve the well-being of people. And they say things like, look, this is something that was conceived by government, and now in 2022, Airbus is selling more planes than Boeing. Hence, I assume the lesson is, let's do more of that in the U.S.
As I read your piece, I think there are three questions that come to my mind in terms of your critique of this piece at American Compass. I'd like to walk through those. The three questions, I think, are: what does it get wrong about Airbus's story? What do they get wrong about Boeing's story? And what do they get wrong about what those stories have in terms of implications for industrial policy? So let's start with Airbus. Walk us through your thoughts on Airbus, the story you just told. Is this really the story of a victory for industrial policy for Europe in creating this, really the largest competitor to Boeing for commercial aircraft? Or are they misunderstanding what should be the takeaway from the Airbus story?
So, I'm going to answer your question in a slightly different way. What is it that they get wrong, that they get right? Right? What they get right is, if you pour billions of dollars into a company, you give them preferential terms, such as, for instance, that they won't have to be repaying any loans that they take on to build their planes until they're actually making a profit. And if they never make a profit and that plane has to be removed from the market, they don't have to pay that loan back. You give them a ton of support. You have presidents after presidents selling Airbus planes around the world. Yes, you can produce an airline that is going to be viable and is going to grab some shares in the market. There's just no doubt about this. But that in and of itself is not controversial, right? That's not. It's like, while a lot of the time government-funded projects end up failing or never taking off the ground, or not adapting to changes to the point that they end up failing, the fact that it's possible is not a revelation. The thing that they are not doing well, and they're not even they're just asserting their case. Hence, it's a good thing. Like, they're not actually looking at the cost that these policies have, right? They're just looking at the benefits, and honestly, from the company's perspective. And just there's, again, the number of times I've testified before Congress about the value, the economic impact of a given program, and next to me was were a lot of people saying, "Hey, I've gotten that government money, and this is good for me." And it happens all the time. Of course, from Airbus perspective, it's shareholder and the people who are employing the supply chain. It's good. What the real question is, what's the real cost of that these subsidies, which it's hard to measure because there's so many of the intangible, like not having to repay a loan, even if you repay it, but you start repaying it long down the road when maybe the private sector would not have taken a risk on you. And so it's like $200 billion at least in the subsidies, plus all these intangible things. What's the cost? I mean, some resources have gone to be taken away from the youth that arguably could be better, and workers taken to be put into that line of business because the incentive created were so strong. What's the cost of this? And they make absolutely no attempt to try to figure that out. They don't even try to see what the impact it's had on manufacturing overall. Like that's a big thing in American Compass. They think manufacturing jobs somehow are like better than other jobs. And when you go and look, I mean, the footprint of Airbus, as successful as it's been, and how, I mean, it's extremely, extremely small in Europe overall. The impact on the economy is hard to tell. I mean, it's just by looking at the health of these countries who have been the economic health, who have been heavily invested in subsidizing Airbus. It's certainly not obvious that these subsidies are doing anything good on net overall. And that's actually kind of, that's the most important thing. And the piece doesn't begin to try to even think about it. They just want to measure the value of industrial policy and the value of creating and subsidizing Airbus by the output, its ability to produce plane and its ability to hire people. But it's not serious. That's not serious work.
Something else that I noticed in reading both your piece and the American Compass piece, and not just the text of the American Compass piece, but I think the context in which they're doing a lot of their work, and the rhetoric that I find that surrounds it, is inveighing against this often invoked, but I find always undefined idea of a belief in, quote, market fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And I find what's interesting to me is the comparison that's being made between Airbus and Boeing, and saying that, Airbus is engaged in this form of industrial policy, or the people who are funding Airbus, providing the subsidies that you've described, are engaged in this industrial policy. And I think kind of implicitly, and kind of a little bit of sleight of hand that goes on, is this implication that the comparisons they're making with Boeing are about some kind of market fundamentalist approach to the way that Americans pursue aircraft manufacturing. And that's hardly the case with Boeing. Could you describe what the actual state of play is for Boeing and the way that the American government has approached aircraft manufacturing, again, at least vis-a-vis Boeing, the largest company that does it in the United States?
Yeah. So the way I found out about that piece is because all of a sudden on Twitter, tons of people are tagging me and that piece and saying, I've been erased. All my work on trying to abolish the Export-Import Bank, which is an export subsidy agency, and that which main beneficiary is Boeing, is just like people like that. That it's as if that doesn't exist, right? And so it was interesting because so people are saying, this piece is like not talking about any of the subsidies that Boeing is receiving. And I hadn't really read the piece, but I just responded by saying, oh yeah, Boeing. Boeing is an artifact of market fundamentalism. And Oren Cass tweeted, well, that's not what the piece is about. So I thought, okay, well, maybe that's not what the piece is about. Maybe it's just, it's more like what I told you at the beginning, the way I understood the piece to be. But the truth is that at the beginning of the piece, they do this funny contrast between Airbus, this company that came out of the mind of government, was funded by government, hundreds of billions of government subsidies and preferential terms on loan, blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, Boeing is this market kind of thing that does that thinks only about short-term profits and does buyback better. And of course, and so there is this idea of contrasting two models, and one that I guess in the head of the American compass is one that's industrial policy versus the market one that's represented by Boeing. And of course, that's laughable. While Boeing wasn't born out of the mind of governments, right? It wasn't created by a consortium of government. It has been supported by government one way or another for decades. In fact, when I started to actually work on the Export-Import Bank is after I read David Stockman, who was the former president, or the former budget director under President Reagan, talking about testifying before Congress to try to abolish, so that was in the 80s, the Export-Import Bank, and talking about how for decades, Boeing had received, it was already the biggest beneficiary. It had already received subsidies for several decades. And so, and when you look above and beyond, it's more than the Export-Import Bank. It's really, it's state and local tax credits. It's Boeing is extremely cozy with everyone in government. When you with Treasury, it's just that the FAA that came out, that was highlighted when their MAX had problems, and unfortunately, like two of them, had fatal failures and killed hundreds of people. That the close relationship between the FAA and Boeing was just Boeing was in charge of certifying its own plane effectively, and so there's tons of money going to the Boeing. It's very different, but so if anything, if you want to be honest about what we're looking at, we're not comparing industrial policy, smart industrial policy with market fundamentalism. What this is looking at, and I thought it would have been more honest if they had said, here are two ways to do industrial policy. We think the Airbus one is better. That's a completely different piece than contrasting them as if one is the product of some sort of just market fundamentalism nonsense. And especially because the way commercial aircraft is done today is at its core, it's a government kind of business. It's just let's not forget that President Obama, when he was giving a talk in Seattle at a Boeing plant, or I don't know, I can't remember, was it Seattle, Washington? I can't remember where it was. But he asked for a gold watch for all the Boeing planes it was selling around the world, right? They're just, because there's also, arguably, I don't know, that's not my area of expertise, but maybe some national security side to it. But though I'm not, there's definitely some geopolitical side to selling planes, which doesn't have to be solved by having presidents selling commercial planes, but just kind of this notion that somehow those two are we're contrasting, like the market versus government, is silly.
Well, your point, too, about local subsidies. I lived in Chicago for about 15 years, and my office was a couple blocks away from the building with the big Boeing logo at the top of it where their corporate headquarters was. And when the subsidies in Chicago dried up to support their presence in the city, they decided to move their corporate office. So I think that's another testament to exactly what you were saying there.
Oh, yes, no. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a laughable comparison. Again, I think it could have been a much more interesting piece by saying, okay, government's going to be involved. How do we do it? Right? And it's like, and acknowledge at their cost. But the other thing that's like remarkable about this piece of all the stuff that they don't do, that they don't do, and in the end, that makes the piece really not serious. Not serious because they're just bragging about Airbus being like this great success. First, it doesn't talk at all about the fact that we've been in recently it ended in a trade war between the U.S. and Europe over those same subsidies that basically the European were impacted with by giving because they went before the WTO to complain. Boeing the U.S. went before the WTO to complain about all these European subsidies that were insane. The U.S. was allowed then to impose $7.5 billion in tariffs, which are of course paid by, U.S. consumers. And then what did the European do? They retaliated with tariffs, right? And they've been at 17 years of trade wars, which has an enormous impact, right? It's not as if it's kind of like, look, you can just put all the subsidies you want, and they're just like, yeah, sure, you impact. There's a lot of taxes, there's a lot of distortion in the capital and job market and all of that stuff, but we just don't care. It has bigger implications. The other thing is like the piece, is bragging about how, people kind of say that that Airbus has a captive audience, a captive customer base in Europe, and look, it's been very, very effective at selling planes around the world. Not untrue, but it also a lot of it did with bribery, literally bribery, and it was just condemned to pay $4 billion in bribes and fees for bribing governments to. So it's like there's this kind of it's just kind of. I don't understand why, like, it's just kind of, and then goes back to kind of, so what is the lesson? What is the lesson we're supposed to kind of learn? Not to mention that, when you listen, Airbus has been effective. It's grown. It's at least, it's a serious player in a world of two, mostly. Right? In a world of two, right? It's a very serious player, but it's not that superior. And the thing that's laughable is that the American Compass could have said, at least it's a serious player, right? And they're kind of neck and neck all the time, kind of like who has the biggest share. But as anyone who's watched the result of an election between two people, right? The gap between them, when one gain a point, the other one lose one. So it's like, the gap can look bigger than it actually really, not bigger than it is. This is how it is, but it's just kind of, it would be much more impressive if there were many, many more competitors. Whether that can be the case, I don't know. But, and the other thing is like it compares, one of the big selling points for how Airbus is super successful is like he compares the 2022 deliveries without actually kind of acknowledging that the reason why those sales are significantly bigger for Airbus is because Boeing has had problems with the MAX and it had to entirely stop delivering and for several years now. And not only are their 2022 number for Boeing the wrong ones, by the way, they say it's 410 when it's really 480. And it's weird because it links to a piece that says 480, But it's just really bizarre. You're really comparing things that you shouldn't be comparing. And they're taking one data point and they're making it as if this is going to be like this forever. But more importantly, in the lesson learned, like, what does it mean? The fact that Airbus is successful and it's been successful at the time where it was put in place, does it mean that it can be reproduced in another sector? And again, we don't talk about, is it worth the cost? That is just never something that they're interested in talking about.
Yeah, your last point there, I think, has a lot of relevance to a point that you were just making as well about there are only two competitors in this market space. So it is one thing, your point is very well taken. It would be one thing entirely if the policies that Europe was engaging in to support Airbus had managed to distinguish it in a crowded market where there are a whole bunch of other commercial aircraft manufacturers, not just Boeing. That would be one thing. But like your point about elections is very well taken, that when one grows, the other shrinks by definition.
Yeah.
As you're only splitting up between the two.
That's interesting too, by the way, is that at the time where they decided to create Airbus, right? They were, I think, three most. I think it was Douglas, Lockheed, and Boeing. And what's interesting is what really Airbus has done is displaced the other two, not Boeing. So the share of the market by Boeing may have gone down a little bit, but not significantly. Now, I don't know how relevant this is. And by the way, interestingly enough, another thing we're asking, I mean, we are not talking about at all in that pieces is, because it's important in the context of China. It's like, okay, so you want government to spend hundreds and billions of dollars plus tons of other privileges to create a company that will compete with our biggest, closest, friendliest trade and military ally. I mean, we can talk about, I think that's kind of a little weird. I mean, again, national security, they may be national. There's certainly geopolitical stuff, but is it really well resolved through commercial aircraft? I mean, I will leave this out to other people, but.
Well, yeah, I think there's another point we should make as well about Boeing in terms of the ways that it is government supported, not just in terms of the kinds of subsidies that you already talked about, but it is also one of the biggest providers to the military sector in the United States. Because money is fungible.
50%, 50%, I think it's like roughly 50 or 40% of its budget of its profit comes from the military. It's much smaller for Airbus, but there's some of that. They do satellite and things like this. So there's some of this. I don't with Airbus, but it's significantly lower.
I want to go back to something you talked about a little bit, and I know you've done a lot of work on, which is the Export-Import Bank. I became mostly familiar with this story through both your work and the work of my friend Tim Carney. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of the Export-Import Bank, how it came to be, and how did it come to be that it kind of so uniquely benefits this one aircraft manufacturing company?
The Export-Import Bank, I mean, it started during the New Deal. It's a New Deal era program. And it was kind of always justified as a way to kind of compete with other government, especially communist government. And it's an agency that does, effectively, so export credit agencies, they either subsidize insurance. That's a small part of what they do. They subsidize insurance for exporters to market that are like, for instance, private insurance are eligibly would not extend because they're too dangerous or whatever. They So it means that a lot of the beneficiaries are domestic. They also they used to extend direct loans, but now it's mostly loan guaranteed to, and their biggest, basically to companies abroad, to foreign companies that will buy a U.S. product. And the reason for this is twofold. The one is to try to promote export through those loans, but it's also to fight the fact that these foreign companies, other foreign manufacturers, are actually subsidized themselves by their government. So it's basically to countervail subsidies. It's a little bit like it's a trade war, effectively, which is idiotic. It's just, it's just like, it doesn't work. So it's like the countervailing argument is a big one. The kind of the fact that they like to talk about themselves as the letter of last resort. And it's a good question. How then, because Boeing has been one of the main beneficiaries for decades, and why is it that particular industry? I do not know. I should probably know that. But the truth of the matter is that on the loan front, on the loan guaranteed front, Boeing is beneficiary of 70% of the activities, and 10 big manufacturers, including GE. It was basically 70% of the overall activity, 40% of the activity benefited for Boeing. And of the overall activity, it's roughly 65 to 70%, depending on the year, benefit 10 big companies. And the thing that's like, when you actually look at the countervailing, it's like with the tariffs, right? It's the countervailing subsidies. So basically, what we know of export subsidies is that they're good, somewhat good for the company, but on net for the nation, they're not good. So this argument that because, let's say, France is subsidizing its exporters and hence hurting the French people or the French economy, we should do the same. It's just something bizarre. In my opinion, we should be, if really we're that hostile and that kind of eager to be superior, we should just let them subsidize the hell out of everything and us do nothing. Why would we jump over the bridge with them? So that's always seemed like a stupid argument. And the other thing is like, the argument is always like, we need to give preferential terms to these foreign companies to buy our stuff. Otherwise, they're going to go buy something else. It's just not proven. For instance, the risk is always that they're going to go buy an Airbus plane. But the companies don't choose this way. They try to see which plane fits the market and the flight that they're going to provide, the routes that they're going to provide, and they think about the financing later, and then of course they'll be eager to get a discounted loan if they can, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't get access to capital. So while they talk of themselves as the letter of last resort, they're not.
Yeah, I think you preempted one of the questions I was going to ask, which is I think one of the arguments that you hear is, and the kind of chronology of this is a little reversed in the Airbus and Boeing situation that we're talking about, because as you detailed in the beginning of this conversation, the decision was made in Europe to subsidize this and support this company to become a competitor to not just Boeing, but McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed. Then it displaces the other two and Boeing becomes its main competitor. But I think the argument you hear is, well, we can't control the policy choices that Europe is making. They're going to choose to support this company and essentially protect it from market impacts that if they weren't making the best product, that people then wouldn't buy it. They're going to subsidize it. They're going to make it so cheap. They're going to make it so advantageous for people to buy Airbus that the playing field has become unfair. That if Boeing were to operate just as in a market fundamentalist world where it has to survive just on the quality of the product that it's putting out there, the competition is unfair. So why shouldn't the United States then do the same kinds of things for Boeing that Europe is doing for Airbus?
Well, by the way, this is the same argument we're using with the semiconductor and China, right? And it's the same argument. And so I think it makes no sense because like look at the history of Airbus, right? But first, there's just a lot of investing a lot of money in commercial aircraft by government is not a guarantee that you're going to be able to produce something good. And it's not just with commercial aircraft.
Well, the Soviet Union invested a lot in the production of certain automobiles, and it certainly didn't make good automobiles.
Exactly. But look also, I mean, the Russian and the Chinese have been trying to actually come up with their own aircraft, and it's just not working for them. And it's not that the Chinese haven't produced something. It's just that people are not buying it for all sorts of reasons. Like they're not buying it because either they don't like it, it doesn't fit their model, they don't trust it. I mean, there's just all sorts of reasons why it's not working. So it's not a done deal. The other thing is like you look at Airbus alone. Airbus has actually produced some very innovative narrow wide planes. I think I'm not an expert, but that's what but they've systematically failed to actually produce a plane that could compete with Boeing planes that have a wider body. And even when they produced one, that was the A320, 380, I think, that was like everyone said was very innovative. People just didn't want it. People didn't want it. They had to stop the production and probably not pay that loan back, right? So, by the way, no mention of this. This is recent. No mention of this in the American Compass piece about the utter failure of a plane that had a great design apparently, but just people didn't want for whatever reason, right? And so there's subsidies. There's just I talk with a lot of people who come here. Especially with all this renewed, intensity over subsidizing semiconductor and things like this. And I talked with some Europeans. There was some from Germany, and I said it's really interesting that your starting point is that whatever the U.S. is doing in terms of just massively subsidizing semiconductors is going to work. Is going to end up producing chips that people want and that are going to start dominating. You're like, people take this for granted that because the government invests is going to work out. When the truth of the matter is that even if you ignore the cost, there's a really great chance that chips are going to be produced, but it's unclear that this is what people are going to want because the subsidies are going to produce something very specific. And if, for instance, anyone innovates even slightly different and those chips could become obsolete or is going to, because there's so many strings attached that comes with the subsidies, that is going to take a long time to produce this. Or that because of all the string attached, companies are not going to try to want this. There's just so many things, but yet people treat all these subsidies as if they're going to deliver, and they're going to not just deliver a chip, a semiconductor, whatever. They're not even like looking at really how much of an impact it's going to have, and even by industry specialists, like you put all these subsidies in. And for the semiconductor, is going to raise potentially, in the base case scenario, the share of the U.S. market by 12 to 14%. So it's actually quite small. But even in that best case scenario, right? I mean, it's just they take this for granted that it's going to work. And I think this is the same that's happening in that conversation about Airbus and Boeing.
There's something else that this is a bit of an anecdotal observation, and I don't know that it's anything that either of us can actually really speak to, but I fly a pretty good amount. And one of the things that you'll notice when you fly regularly is, these planes are incredibly expensive. The airlines that purchase them usually have them in their fleet for a very long period of time. I've certainly flown on planes that are quite obviously several decades old. And in most cases, the major airlines, and we can get into a whole other conversation on government subsidies when it comes to the airlines themselves.
Yeah.
When they move out of the fleet of some of the larger airlines, they're often just sold off to some of the smaller airlines who run even older planes there. So I've always wondered about as I read both your piece and the American Compass piece, the numbers about deliveries, that means something in some way. But, this is unlike semiconductors where you're constantly buying a whole bunch of this product.
Yeah.
There are regular purchases, of course, of commercial airlines, but it is something that stays within the fleet of these airlines for a very long period of time. And I am certainly not equipped to be able to suss out the meaning and the impact of that within this kind of a conversation. But it just seems like a very different product in that sense.
Yeah. I agree. And I don't know a whole lot about the manufacturing of commercial aircraft. I know more now than I did before I wrote that piece. In fact, when at first I was going to write a response, and then that was going to be just a blog post. And then I thought, the more I thought about it, I thought actually, I'm not kind of answering what they're trying to actually say. So it just required this kind of bigger treatment. But so I'm still not, I'm certainly not an expert in that particular field. My colleague Gary Lepp is, if you want to know all things about travel and airlines and aircraft, go to View from the Wings. It's a really great blog, and it's often really funny too. It's like a lot of links to airline related and stuff. And he helped me a fair amount for this piece. But one of the things that I know is that in the same way as, it looks like, so for instance, like Boeing could be getting into trouble because it looks like they're not doing very much, at least it seems, to replace their 748 or 87, right? Which was their big, just kind of amazing piece of technology and amazing innovation, amazing. And I think the MAX, was supposed to be some of that, but it's also, as you hinted at, like the ability to expand your market is not just a matter of supplying, right? You can produce planes if there's no demand on the other side because there's a recession or people have enough planes and governments are restricting the number of airlines that can actually exist.
Or we decide to shut down the air travel market for an entire year because of a pandemic.
Yes, but then it's like there's a lot of regulations that are actually preventing airlines from competing, and the U.S. is doing a lot of that, right? It's constantly trying to on the one hand, it's subsidizing Air India, which then is going to compete with Delta, with planes that are effectively discounted, and it's a significant amount of money. But on the other hand, U.S. airlines have constantly lobbying government to try to prevent foreign airlines to effectively. You don't fly. There's a reason why you don't fly from LA to DC on an Air India flight unless it's a flight. I think the rule is like unless it comes from. I don't exactly know what the rule, but I assume that you can do it when you fly from Bombay to whatever, and you have to stop
I had a couple international flights last year, and I took American Airlines from Grand Rapids to either Chicago or New York, and then I took an American Airlines flight to London, and then it was a British Airways flight from London to Oslo, or it was British Airways coming back to New York, and then I took an American Airlines flight from New York to Grand Rapids.
I mean, there's just like airlines don't want foreign airlines.
Yep.
So you have all these kind of regulatory competing forces, and they have a big impact on the demand for planes. I mean, it's like the Jones Act, right? I mean, there's a reason why. There's a reason why that like those boats, those vessels are so expensive in a lot of ways, because they restrict who can actually do things and deliver things from port to port. And this, I assume, I don't know, but I assume a lot of that plays out. So it's going to be interesting. I'm very curious. I'm very curious to see if that kind of market share advantage, holds. I mean, it's small, by the way. Really small, but it's not as if Boeing has lost its way in a lot of ways, and in big part it's because it's really a crony institution that devotes probably a lot of its resources getting favors from government officials as opposed to focusing on producing planes. At the very least, that's what a lot of people are saying. And they've gotten so cozy with politicians that they also are like not worried about competition. And when they're competition, if you remember a few years ago, they try to prevent Bombardier from selling planes to whomever, right? They just spend a lot of money and resources and time fighting against competitors, not by becoming a better company that produces better planes, that produces new planes, but by actually trying to block competitors. So it's going to be now that American Compass has put this issue on my radar, I'm going to be following it just for the sake of it.
For the final question, I want to zoom out to the 50,000-foot view, which is, I guess, where we're flying at for this question. Industrial policy and the promotion of the idea of industrial policy seems to be a big reason behind American Compass's work. Presuming that you think engaging in industrial policy, and I think this is a fair assumption, is a mistake on the United States' part. Why is the idea of when we see kind of the turmoil in the economy, and we always get references to places like, Youngstown, Ohio, and all of that, where industry has kind of just been decimated. What are the arguments against an industrial policy approach like the one that American Compass is advocating for, not just in the case of airline manufacturing here, but I think in a whole bunch of other sectors? What are the problems that approach creates?
Well, I think we've touched on a lot of it, right? I mean, it's just like, when you talk with people who advocate for industrial policy, they always point to like some success stories, but they never actually show you. They measure success by showing you that there's a product that was created, and that they employ people, and they never talk to you about the actual cost of it. Because it's hard. How many jobs is displaced? Has it actually been a benefit for the economy as a whole? We have actually a fair amount of research that shows that it's not the case. It may be good for the bottom line of these companies, but it's not a net beneficiary for the economy. But more importantly, industrial policy by design has to be a policy that favors some, so that picks winners. And again, because it has a cost at the expense of others. So that's the core, right? It's like we're gonna give lots of subsidies to semiconductor. We're going to try to revive manufacturing. We're going to do this and that. I mean, independently of what I think about their goals, which I think are just not good, I it means they're going to pick winners. It's going to cost a lot of money. Very often the money is misallocated. So it means that the cost is even bigger than it was going to be. It's usually doesn't work that great. And it's also, it has, one of the costs that it has is like it prevents innovation. It prevents better product to come on the market. It prevents, it kind of makes the industries like not as flexible, and able to kind of adapt to change. Scott Lincecum had a good piece at the Dispatch, looking at South Korea, which arguably has done a lot of industrial policy and invested a lot in the tech sector. When that area is affected, the whole country is affected, right? And when you subsidize just one type of product, if innovations are going somewhere else, you're stuck. There's a path dependency aspect to this. But more importantly, like the reason why industrial policy is making a comeback is because people have concerns about workers in some areas of the country, and there are places where it used to be the case that when you had an economic shock or a crisis or whatever, unemployment in some areas would go up, and then as people would change jobs or move away, the unemployment would go down. But this adjustment is not really happening. So then you have these pockets of unemployment, of high unemployment, lower wage in the country, which, by the way, the disparities between different areas always existed, right? And they're like, you have people, especially men, moving out of the labor force. So they're like, these things are real. But I think the problem is when you focus on industrial policy as a way to solve these problems, that is not going to work. That is not going to, you may produce a plane, but that is not going to be by hiring the people in those towns you're trying to help. And so as such, they're focusing on the wrong thing when we could be having a very productive conversation about what could be done, if anything, to help. And there's a lot of things. You could remove all the barriers, all the incentive to actually stay there, remove all the barriers to move, get new jobs, get training somewhere, like zoning and land use and all sorts of things, occupational licensing and all that stuff. We're not talking about this. We're talking about all the ways that the government can do something that is not going to help these people. And we know, it's basically taking the wrong target. It's saying it's the market, which has actually been a tremendous force in helping people not just get out of poverty, not just have better lives, that's produced just amazing things, but also kind of, if left if left relatively unhindered, it's actually been a great way for people to adjust to better lives. If by saying that market is the enemy, though it's not perfect, I'm not claiming it's perfect, you're just basically, you're just risking to actually make things much worse.
Veronique de Rugy is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She's the author of the article, A Closer Look at Aircraft Industrial Policy, published at National Review, which we have been discussing today. Veronique, thanks so much for joining us today on Act in Line.
Thank you for having me.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Act in Line, I'm Eric Cohn.